but at the same time, we saw how, or we wanted to know what is the difference in between this perspective, how they build, or how different societies build a different idea in between us and them, and if it's a link in the level of complexity that they have, or if it's not.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. I don't follow.
What is the link between the duality, also then, and the rising of complexity in social structures and societal structures?
Okay, yes, right, okay. Well, obviously, we also have, when we're considering us and them, we also have to consider what anthropologists call fission and fusion. In other words, if you take a family, uh, they may quarrel among themselves, but unite against their immediate neighbors. Then again, they may quarrel with their immediate neighbors, but the neighbors and the family may unite because they're all the same village. And the village may quarrel with its neighbors, but on the other hand, unite with them against the larger. You understand this is a process which can be extended more or less indefinitely, of having different levels of us and them, which of course we have in every complex society. So that, in fact, the notion of us and them is in a sense a relative notion. It's not an absolute notion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We we understand like the relative notion, the relativism of the notion between us and them. In that way, and in relation to the question that I formulated before, um, right now we are also living in this um, national state world, or the world is divided in the national state, and the interrelation between them, more or less, uh, it is the condition, or it condition our existence in a way. Uh, we can we can maybe see another way to create, it will be not exactly the same that national state, um, a way to communicate in between us like humans that, I don't know, maybe could resolve the difference between us and them that we were talking about. What do you think about that?
Again, I don't quite follow you. I don't quite understand.
I mean,
¿Puedes decirme la pregunta y yo se la replanteo?
no, uh, right now we're living, okay, estamos viviendo en un mundo global, con diferentes estados y con, bueno, identidades que se comparten por esos estados. ¿Hay alguna forma de salir de esta integración y vernos en una relación distinta nosotros ellos que esta?
Well, let me try to translate what he just said. He's asking if, well, right now we're living in a society where there's a lot of different cultures that are buying together, are experiencing this face-to-face interactions that they didn't have before, and this is traversed by the us and them, the us and them duality you were talking us about. So the question that he's asking is, is it possible? Is it in any way possible? Do you think is it in any way possible that we can manage to overcome this us and them duality in order to think of ourselves more like a species, like an identification as a species?
I think it's extremely difficult. We in Britain have this in two levels. We have a large number of immigrants from other cultures, from Asia and Africa, and the concept of multiculturalism has developed in response to that. We have also been members of the European Union, which again is multicultural in a different way. It's a form of federalism. And I would have to say, simply from looking at the course of history, that they haven't gone very well. In particular, there are, it seems to me, fundamental differences of identification, which are very difficult to bridge without one culture having to give way to another. For example, I mean, linguistically, it would be impossible in Britain to have more than one language. Essentially, English is the language which is the official language. In Wales and Scotland, there is some provision for their traditional languages, but that position is extremely small and doesn't really impinge on the rest of us. In Europe, again, in the European Union, in practice, we have found that if a Dutchman wants to speak to a Bulgarian, they will speak in English. There's no other way around that. So that's merely on the level of language that it's exceedingly difficult to have more than one language. There has to be one system of law, and there has to be one system, it seems to be, of political values. You can't, and where we have, for example, there are some Muslims who say that elections are contrary to God's will, they should only be divine law. Well, that clearly can't work. They have to accept that English law is the basis of law. You can't have separate systems of law, and so on we go. And I think that there are very major difficulties in trying to combine different cultures. We've seen, for example, that Britain has decided to leave the EU because their view of how a society should be organized is fundamentally contrary to ours in a number of ways. No one is saying, we're not saying one is better or worse than the other, we're simply saying they're different. And I think that it is really phenomenally difficult to either to have multiculturalism or to have something like the European Union. And if you do, then a great number of things which we take for granted, for example, in a democracy, there has to be a demos, a people, so that those who represent them can be seen as representing their constituents. To have a representative government for 27 different nations is, in a sense, impossible, because there isn't a demos. There are 27 or whatever different peoples, and therefore something has to give, and what you end up with is essentially ruled by an unelected bureaucracy. It's the only way it can work, which is not acceptable to many of us, which is why we left the EU. And so I think, in answer to this question, there is no obvious solutions other than concessions which have to be made by one group or another, which they may find they're not willing to make. So I'm afraid, in answer to your question, I really can't come up with anything.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
Totally okay.
But we wanted to know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, don't worry. We want to know about your epistemological position. Let's say your independent epistemological position in relation to the mainstream of the anthropological theory.
Yes.
And specifically in the integration that you have done of the epistemology, the genetic epistemology developed by Jean Piaget.
Yeah.
How did you come to consider the genetic epistemology as a structural part of your theory?
Right. I'll answer that question. When I did my master's thesis, it was on African notions of causation. So I was very interested in modes of thought very soon after I started in anthropology. And I was particularly struck in writing that thesis by a passage in Godfrey Leonhardt's book on the Dinka, in which he said that they had no conception of the mind, which in any way equated with our own notion of the mind as something mediating experience into patterns of thought. And that remained with me for a long time. And when I was working in New Guinea, I was particularly struck by the fact that they had no system of counting beyond single and pair. And it therefore seemed to be obvious that if they didn't have that, they could only do elementary tallying on their fingers. That therefore, obviously, they couldn't have a notion of addition and subtraction or multiplication and division. Well, then I thought, well, why does it matter? In their society, they can clearly get along perfectly well without counting and doing the arithmetical operations that we do. And therefore, a child coming into the Tawade society would not have to develop its modes of thought in the way that a child in our own literate society inevitably has to do. One couldn't survive in our society really unless one could basically do at least elementary counting. Well, then once I started thinking in terms of, well, what do children start out with in terms of their cognitive processes and how do these develop, I naturally moved on to looking at the work of Piaget. In particular, I started with some of his early works, The Child's Conception of Reality and so on and so forth. And I was very much struck by the same attention to detail in his work as I had to do as an anthropologist. In other words, his interviews with children meticulously recorded and their answers. And I could see there that there was an empirical resemblance between the kinds of things that children were saying and the kinds of things that my Tawade was saying. And then if one then goes on to accept his proposition that the individual is in an active interaction with his or her environment as they grow up, this seemed to me far more plausible than particularly the behaviorist, either the behaviorist notion or the notion popular with anthropologists that the human individual is, the mind of the human individual is rather like an empty bucket. And what happens is that collective representations get poured into this bucket, and this is what the adult ends up with. And it did not seem to me in any way plausible that you could simply regard human thinking as a collection of collective representations, because how do these collective representations get passed on from generation to generation? Well, only through the minds of individuals. You don't, as an anthropologist, you don't meet a collective representation walking along the road or floating or in the sky. You have to talk to individual people, and that's the only way that those representations, whether they be of number systems or classifications or ideas about cause and effect, the only way those representations can be transmitted is through individual thought processes. And so this idea coming from Durkheim that you can't explain collective representations by psychological processes was not entirely correct. There are of course, collective representations. Let us say Darwin's theory of evolution, which we can learn out of textbooks, and which has been certainly was developed by social processes, by Darwin publishing books, people reading them, discussing his theory and so on and so forth. There were social processes which were involved in the development of the theory of evolution, but there were also individual cognitive processes. How could there not be? And therefore, it seemed to me that the whole traditional anthropological separation of individual thought processes from collective representations had to be wrong. And we could see it. I mean, if one thinks about it, it's perfectly obvious that individual thought processes and collective representations are very closely related. And therefore, it was entirely justifiable, it seemed to me, to use developmental psychology to explain some of the characteristics of collective representations. That's how I got there.
Yes, you did answer to our question.
Yeah.
And we,
I, I have,
Dale.
or you can. Okay.
I was in the same line of what you just said. I would like to ask you if you could tell us more. How did you get to this conclusion with Piaget, of using Piaget? Is there how did you knew that this could be an option? How did it came to you that this could be an option?
Oh, well, I'd heard in my general reading of the existence of developmental psychology. And so once I'd decided that obviously the way that children learn to think was relevant to my anthropological work, it was perfectly simple. I just went along to Blackwell's and bought some copies of his books and read them.
Okay. I have a question also in relation to your position. How can you explain the abandon on the part of the social anthropology of its principal aim? I mean, when it emerged as a formal discipline, that is to say, the study of primitive society.
Yes,
Why?
I think yes. This is a very relevant question at the present time, as you know. The early anthropologists, I mean, starting, if you like, from Fraser and Tyler, it was perfectly obvious to them that small-scale, non-literate societies based on kinship and gender and age, where there was no division of labour with very simple economies, and no money and no political centralization, it was very early on realized that these societies, which they were meeting, of course, in the process of colonialization, were fundamentally different from the kinds of societies that we live in. And therefore, all the great figures in anthropology, certainly Evans Pritchard, Blackman, Fortes, Radcliffe Brown, and everyone else, accepted as obvious that that primitive societies had special characteristics, and it required specialist knowledge and fieldwork to establish how these societies worked. Unfortunately, politics reared its ugly head, and it was came to be supposed that the notion of a primitive society was discriminatory and racist and all the rest of these things. And therefore one was, in fact, really engaged in something which was denying, I think, human equality. It seemed to me this is pure nonsense. But that nevertheless is where we are now. And so, whereas when I was starting anthropology and for my professional career, I have worked on the understanding of trying to understand primitive societies. If you look on the websites of anthropology departments now, you will discover that cultural anthropology or social anthropology is simply about studying the differences between people, which to me is completely banal and pointless. Well, you could go on forever discussing differences. The question is to understand why these differences exist and why, in particular, there are major differences between types of society, which, as you say, are primitive societies and societies based on the nation state and so on and so forth. And I think it's essentially political.
And do you have any clue about why this political correctness is so strong right now, or since some time ago?
Oh, well, you're a sociologist. It's for you to tell me. I don't pretend to have any special knowledge about modern society other than living in one and reading the newspapers. I think that America has been, the United States has been a prime mover in this. I think because they have the special problem of slavery and the fact that their ethnic minorities were brought forcibly, their ancestors were brought forcibly to the United States and have not exactly prospered ever since. I think the Americans have a huge guilt complex about their ethnic minorities. And all the rest of us have to suffer. I remember an American anthropologist came up to McMaster, and she was an archaeologist, but she started saying how it was racial discrimination to look for stone buildings, because this was suggesting there was something superior about stone to mud and daub, and this was something which archaeologists shouldn't be doing. It seemed to me this was the view of a lunatic, and I more or less told her. And in fact, it's quite interesting that Africans themselves think that stone is special. And you may know that in Zimbabwe, it's named, the name Zimbabwe, is a stone-built enclosure in one part of the country, which is certainly indigenous, and they themselves are particularly proud of it, having their own indigenous stone building. So this is just an example of how American anthropology and archaeology gets distorted by politics and into seeing racial discrimination where it's nothing of the kind. It's simply a recognition of fairly obvious facts. And so I do very much blame the Americans for this. I think that they are very much responsible for distorting the whole of anthropology. But it started, if you'll remember, at the beginning of the 20th century with racial theory, which was genuinely racist, not the non-racism. But this was the idea that different races had different capacities. These were genetic, and Boas, as you will know, in particular, was very strong in denouncing this, which was perfect as a scientific proposition, was a perfectly valid thing to say. But then, of course, it brought the whole idea of politics into anthropology, that anthropologists had a social duty to take a political stance on things, which I think was an incredibly harmful development. We're not here we're here to try and establish the facts. And what our politics are should have nothing to do with that. But that I should say, I think it was Boas, the anti-racism, Margaret Mead, and the rest of that tradition, which then continued and exercised its nefarious influence on social anthropology as a whole. That's my personal take on it.
Okay, it's really likely, at least for me. I don't know if the rest you guys have other questions.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
In the first chapter of your book, A Ship of Fools, that you published in 2018,
Yes.
you tell how when you finished your field work among the Tawade of Papua New Guinea,
yes,
that your informant named Amo Lume gave he gave you his grandfather's skull and thigh bone as a farewell gift.
Just for a moment.
And that they are still on your desk.
Yeah, just a moment. Here is Amo Lume's. That's what the skull he gave me.
Okay.
It was the custom for the Tawade when their ancestors died. Well, it's not when their ancestors, when their relatives died. They would expose their bodies until they were reduced to skeletons, and then the bones, when they held a dance, they would put the bones in string bags, and it was an honor for if you were a guest at a dance, to be given a string bag of their bones to dance with. So to give me his ancestor, his grandfather's skull, was very much in the cultural tradition of the Tawade. It's actually interesting if you look at this. I'll just show you. I don't know if you can see it. Right up.
Yeah.
No, I don't think I can't. There's a big dent in the skull where he's been bonked on the head, obviously as a young man, and the dent is now completely healed over. So that is an additional oddity about this about that skull.
That was a little detail that when I read the book, I was really eager to ask you about it, because it seemed to me to be like a really colorful experience of what you lived there.
Yes, field work has a tremendous. To do field work is a life transforming experience, and it's also an intellectually transforming experience, because you have to put together a worldview and a society from experience, building it up after one has got some capacity in the language. You have to construct this. When you leave, as I've been fortunate to do in both in Ethiopia, Papua New Guinea, I felt, well, at least I've got a pretty good idea of how it all works, and that's a very exciting thing to be able to construct.
Yeah. Also, in relation to your life in between Consus and Tawade, and how the difference also in between both of them, both of these cultures, in a way, impact your view. You can talk a little bit about that, how the difference between the Consus and the Tawade represent an impact on your view, like an anthropologist.
Yeah, when I'd finished doing my fieldwork with the Consu, and I'd written it up, and I was a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie, I thought, well, I really enjoyed fieldwork, so I wanted to do some more. But I thought it was very important to go to a completely different area, because it's almost inevitable if one has, it is inevitable if one has done fieldwork only in one area, they will become the archetypes in terms of which you interpret everything that you read. So I went to, I was staying in Montreal, and I went to see Professor Salisbury at McGill University, and I said to him, where do you think, I thought of New Guinea as being another extremely good place to work. It had an Australian administration, is politically stable, lots of anthropologists have been there, many tribes. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk to a New Guineanist. And he said, well, Mountain Papua has not been studied. And that, if I were you, I would go there. I read obviously a certain amount of ethnography, and I realized that these were extremely different societies from the Congo. And so they were the opposite of the Congo in almost every way you can think of. The Congo had a highly formal society, very moral, very much concerned with keeping the peace, with being good neighbors, with obeying God's law, and so on and so forth. The Tawade, utter opposites. They're only supernatural beings. Where I was telling you in my paper with the culture heroes, Agotiban, who were monsters, who terrorized the Tawade's ancestors, ate them, raped their children, destroyed their homes and everything else. They were absolutely appalling homicidal maniacs. And the Congo the Tawade themselves were extraordinarily impulsive, had remarkably high levels of violence in their traditional society, really had very little notion of social control, and like almost all the societies actually in Papua New Guinea, had no formal means of mediation, which as an Africanist I took for granted. I thought all societies have that. No, they didn't. And if your pig strayed onto my garden and rooted up my sweet potatoes, I'd go along and see you. And how it ended would be very much a matter of our personal dispositions. You might be prepared to give me compensation, or you might take your bow and shoot an arrow into me. It was at that level, as it were, spontaneity and informality. Most extraordinarily, and here I'm thinking about anthropologists tending to think in universals. What most people, if you ask them, say, well, everybody can count. They must be able to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, can't they? No. My own expectation was that greeting people would be a cultural universal, saying hi there, morning, good night, the rest of it. I had assumed that all peoples did that. Tawade didn't. If you were joining a group, you'd simply come up and start talking. If you were going, you'd either walk off. You might say, well, I'm going now. That's it. And when I was lighting my fire in the evening, my stove, it was pretty cold up there in the mountains, I'd be talking to some chap out on the veranda of my house, and I bent down and light the fire, and look out, he'd gone. He wouldn't say good night to us. Whereas the Congo, sleep in peace, sleep well, good morning, peace be with you, friend. And I asked myself, why would it be that the Tahuadi didn't have greetings. The only thing I can come up with, I can't prove this. If you say hi to somebody and they just ignore you, will you feel humiliated? And the Tahuadi had a very, very strong sense of personal dignity. So if you don't say hi to anyone, then you can't be humiliated. And I suspect that might have been why. They did adopt to some extent the European greetings. But they would say bye bye when they met you. I mean, they had no idea of when to use them, so no, that was a fascinating lesson in not thinking that something is universal just because you can't imagine anything being different. No, and so it was hugely important to have these two societies constantly in my mind interacting one with another. And if you think of some possibility, and then you say, well, actually, no, the Konzu didn't do it like that, or no, well, the Tahuadi would do it some other way. And it enormously arranged, although it was only going from 1 to 2, it was like also going from hot to cold. So you covered, as it were, imaginatively a huge spectrum simply by going to these very, very different societies. And I'm very glad I did it.
I remember some part in the book of the Tawade in which you said that when you asked them about why they could not live in longer groups,
Yes.
they answered that it was not the way that they can live. And in your book about how we got here, you also talk about how is the difference between social relation, the number of social relation, and the number of people who live in a social group. I mean that the first one is exponential function, and the second one is just linear function. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, how in for example the specific group of Tawada not really it was not necessary, but also not possible to develop uh, longer groups or bigger groups.
Well, the problem was that they each what I call in my book a tribe, which is my own definition, happens to be a named separate group which thinks of themselves as separate and are not allied with anything else. They were about, as I said, around about 200 people, and my bunch had 6 clans. There was the clan which claimed to have got there first, the Karawai, and then other groups had joined them by invitation, or they said, "Can we come and join?" Yes, because actually, up to a certain point, numbers are an advantage. For hunters and gatherers, no, they can quickly become too much for the local ecology to support. But if once you started growing sweet potatoes in particular, you can have a huge population. There was an enormous amount of land, so there was no ecological reason why you couldn't have large numbers of people. And also, it's actually an advantage because if you've got lots of people, they're good for having for defence, and also you can have if you're going to have competitive feasting, well, the more the better. The bigger feast you can put on, and also in collaboration in making gardens, they had to fence them because they had pigs. And so, if you've got lots of men to do the cutting of the timber and fencing, that's an advantage too. So there was an advantage in having lots of people, and for their dance villages, they had many hundreds of people living together for quite a few months on end. But we come back to this whole question of absence of mediation and the fact that there were no hereditary chiefs. You might have had a situation, for example, in which the Karawai clan had a lineal head, and he would be regarded as the sacred, the paramount chief, and everyone else would accept that. That would have been perfectly feasible. And of course, in Polynesia, that's what you do have. But in Melanesian societies, like most of Papua New Guinea, there's no sense really of no strong sense of lineality. and so you don't get everyone of the same clan living together. You don't have, there may be a big man in a clan, but he doesn't inherit his office. He has to be a big man because of his personality and his strength of personality and his political skills in getting followers. So essentially, he's a faction leader. And all you have in these groups, like the Tawadi, is that in each tribe, as I've defined it, there will be a number of different factions. That's the first. There's no stable hereditary authority which is respected. And secondly, the Tawadi are extremely quarrelsome. As I said, they have a great sense of personal dignity. And just to give you an example, one chap in one, they'll live in different hamlets. One chap in one hamlet sent some boys with a gift of pork to someone living in another hamlet. And he calls out, and they call from one place to another. Have they arrived? Have those boys arrived with you? So this chap said yes, they had. A little while later, the chap who'd sent the boys with the pork arrived in this man's house and set fire to it. And so there was a fight developed, and in court, the chap said, "Yes, he said, the chap who'd sent the pork said, when I called out, you didn't answer." And the chap said, "Yes, I did. You didn't hear me." And so as a result, one chap comes over and sets the other chap's house on fire. Now, if you have people who are as easily inflamed to violence as this, you can see this is inherently a difficult situation. And if you look at the figures, the crime statistics, there were almost as many, or even in some cases more cases of murder, assault, vandalism, injury within the tribe as there were between one tribe and another. So A, you have no mediation. B, you have no stable authorities. You don't even have elders' councils. And three, you have very easily enraged people who are impulsive and commit acts of violence. And so when you say to them, why don't you all live in a nice dark village? Well, they could for a few months. They could manage to do that. But the inherent tensions, they said, we can't live together because of our fathers. In other words, because of all the inherited grievances we've got against one another, we had to live separately. So in fact, if you looked at the hamlets, they were relatively peaceful. There wasn't too much fighting within the hamlet, but between one hamlet and another of the tribe, there could often be quite serious violence and homicide.
With your position as an anthropologist in all this configuration of violence, did you ever felt danger or?
No, absolutely not. No. But various reasons. First, to take the Konzo, they were initially nervous that I would upset their religion. They thought I might be connected to the mission. And when they discovered that I had absolutely no connection with the missions, other than being friends with them, but they were very pleased by that. And they soon came to like me, having me living there. I'd done nothing to offend them. I treated them with medicines. They were delighted to have me. And although I myself didn't have any fear, because there's no reason why they should have attacked me. They themselves were concerned that I might be robbed, because I kept a bag of money in my house, and so they more or less insisted I got myself a pistol to protect myself. I use it to shoot a snake. That's the only thing. I was perfectly safe among the Konzo. Among the Tawadi too, as I've said, they regarded the white man as not human. They thought, in fact, I was one of their own who had come back from the dead. So I had considerable supernatural powers, and I think if anyone had seriously threatened me, I would have openly put a curse on him, and I think that would have been extremely effective. I was essentially a big man in their society, and nobody killed big men because the vengeance was very, very serious. I don't think I was ever in any danger. I certainly never felt it. May have been deceiving myself, but no, I was not in any fear of my personal safety.
I asked you this because I remember the ethnographic description of Dan Everett
Oh
among
yes,
the
yes,
Piraha,
Yeah.
yes.
and he speaks about this episode where when some colonists came with alcohol and
Yes,
that made like a big
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, that was a complication because both in the Tawadi and the Konzo, I was interacting solely with those people. I didn't have a third party coming in and stirring up the sort of problem that you're referring to. So I think in those circumstances, the anthropologist might well be in a much more exposed and dangerous position. But my relations were simply, as it were, between me and the Konzo, me and the Tawade, and there was nothing there that would have caused them to want to attack me. I did a frightful row with someone once in public because he'd insulted me by not giving me pork when he should have done. And I gave him a real blasting in public, but it was effective. He didn't try to revenge it. I describe it in my book.
Yeah, it was there. I remember.
There's
Yeah.
a question in the chat, if you can watch it.
Yeah, it is. It is a question in the chat. Maybe it is something like if you have an idea or a strategy in which like the people who right now is doing field work in different cultures can have like the difficulties in communication in between them to maybe describe the societies in their autonomy or something like that.
So I didn't quite follow.
I'm sorry. The question is the question is if you could if you can give some hints about what of how that I don't know, some hints that could help people that are experiencing difficulties in field work within different cultures, like yeah.
Well, obviously in South America, you have your own indigenous peoples there, and I know remarkably little about that. So it's not for me to advise you on that. I mean, one can only give certain very broad advice, which is.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Keep going. I'm sorry.
I only give some rather obvious and broad advice. It's essential to talk to people already living there to find out what the basic situation is. As, for example, when I arrived in the Conzo, the first thing I talked about the missionaries. And missionaries, I may say, have certainly been enormously important in my field. Where I don't think I could survive without them. I was told about the local governor, who was something of a tyrant, and I was advised about that. So, in other words, advice on the local political situation, on things that you need, which you must have. The thing I most regret in my anthropological training was not being given a course in linguistics to understand how it is that one can elicit the grammar of a language from getting samples of the language. And linguists are clearly very good at doing this. And I had the advantage of a school teacher in the Conzo who was a Conzo, who could speak pretty good English. And I got quite a lot of information from him, but he was not a linguist. And it would have been, he wasn't really able to tell me very much about Conzo grammar. And I had to learn what I did the hard way. And so getting a training in linguistics, I think, if I were going to the field again, is something which I would very, very much advise. And really, uh, you obviously have to equip yourself properly for the field and have to be able to be physically comfortable. If you're living in with terrible food and you can't sleep at night, this is very bad for doing field work. So that would seem to be a fairly obvious precaution to get that right. And beyond that, I don't think. Well, I'll say what I will say is yes, learning the language. If one is dealing with a people, indigenous people who have no written language, you can't have a grammar of it beforehand. It actually builds up a very good relationship with the people because they enjoy teaching you, and you develop. I think a good bond with the people by learning the language as you interact with them, and it gives you an incentive to interact. So that's actually a positive aspect of field work. But beyond that, it's very much a matter of if you're lucky. Yeah, if you're lucky, you will after a while you will find people who are A, intelligent and well informed, and B, like talking to you, which they may do as a break from the monotony of ordinary life. So you'll almost certainly end up with a number of key informants whom you come to rely on, and they will get used to your way of speaking and thinking. If you interact with them over a period of many months, those are extremely important people to cultivate. I would not have been able to do my field work unless I had succeeded in doing that. It's very handy when I went to the consulate to have a cook, and my cook on the consulate, Garrida, was invaluable in telling me what was going on, what the people thought I was doing, tipping me off about this, that, and the other. So if a suitable man appears, that's can be a major bonus. Among the Tawadi, there was one guy who might have been a cook, but he was so slow and so incompetent, he drove me mad, and I couldn't consider having him to work for me. So I had to manage without. But it would have been better if I'd had someone who could who worked in that capacity. I would say certainly for a male anthropologist, and for females that matter, I think having romantic liaisons with the people you're studying is a notably bad idea and should be avoided probably at all costs. Can create all sorts of complications and resentments, and something which is, I think, the anthropologists should keep very well clear of that. Can't think of anything else. It's not like archaeology. It's not a technical discipline that has, as it were, obviously in conducting a professional excavation, there are a huge number of rules that you would have to follow. The social anthropologist is not in that position. It's a matter really of using one's common sense in dealing with other people, not doing things to offend them. And though you may get away with it because it will be attributed to ignorance. But no, beyond that, I can't think of any specific advice I would give you about fieldwork.
Thank you. I think that maybe the question was also referred to this situation nowadays that you describe very well in several of your books about different positions that are like really blind with facts for saying something, or for put it that way. That
I didn't quite understand.
I'm saying about that maybe the question was not just referred about the field work, but also about how to deal with the theoretical confusion that right now is like in all social sciences.
Oh, right.
And these different positions like evolutionary psychology or cultural or postmodern theories that refuse to accept certain facts, and also is from all these positions there is an attack for the notion of primitive society.
Yes.
And I want to connect this with a question on my own, because I want to ask you if you think that this kind of problems to accept a notion from a notion of development, of cultural and historical development, has to do with some kind of difficulty in studying ourselves. And Norbert Elias, in some of his books, said that maybe there is a kind of blockage that we human beings have to think about ourselves, and that we need like this development that we can follow across history. We are in some point that we need like go further and like to gain new tools to think about ourselves in order to go beyond that blockage. And I want to ask you if you have found something like that in your investigation and in your practice as anthropologist, and in that something that can explain that right now is absolutely difficult just to talk about primitive society or about differences in a way like not that is not seen as anthropocentric or Eurocentric or that kind of stuff.
Well, when I started my my fieldwork in Ethiopia, structural functionalism was the dominant theory, maintaining that every custom has some necessary part to play in the life of every society, and also that culture, and there was a significant difference. There were social institutions on the one hand, and there was culture on the other, which supported the institutions. And it soon became clear to me that this was nonsense, that there was no particular reason why the Conzo should have some of the institutions that they did. They were not necessary for the survival of their society, and also that social institutions and culture could not be clearly separated. They were mutually interlocking. And so that would be a case of simple of comparing one's experience with the theory and saying, well, quite clearly the theory is wrong, it's inadequate. Similarly, among the Taoidi, I could see that actually their society was set up almost to maximize conflict, not to reduce it. So in both those cases, I was looking at the evidence in front of me and say, well, I'm sorry, the theory simply doesn't square with the evidence. Now, coming on to this dismissal, the rejection of the idea of primitive society, I think one has to take the same approach. Well, here's the evidence, as I do in the introduction to Ship of Fools, in saying these are the basic characteristics of primitive society. They're not the same as ours, and there's the evidence, take it or leave it. I think you just have to shove the evidence in front of people and say, sorry, there is such a thing as primitive society, and you've got to accept it. You just have to keep beating away at them. I don't see any other alternative. Just tell them they're talking nonsense. Theory has to be. Well, I have a particular loathing of abstract theory, which is not relatable to facts, and I think the facts always come first, and theory has to adapt to them. And if people don't want to accept the existence of primitive society, that's their problem. And that's why I wrote Ship of Fools, among other things, simply to ram this message home.
I have a question, maybe we have time.
I think we can go until maybe 10 minutes more, if it's okay with
Sure.
Professor Hallpike. Okay.
Yeah, sure. It's pity we don't have a drink, but we can't do that.
That would be great.
Yeah, that would be great. But I have a question in relation to your book, like how we got here.
Yeah.
In that book, you said that humans reach like the formal state that Piaget development more or less in when the state was developed during history. But also, it is pretty clear in the book that it is not at that moment that we developed science.
No.
And it is not at that moment that we developed a modern society, let's say. Can you explain me a little bit more about how the formal state in the states of Piaget are not enough to do that step, and what kind of role play the complexity of the society that emerged in Europe after Renaissance, or maybe a little bit before?
Well, the most important part, to answer your question there, is the peculiar characteristics of European society by comparison with all the other civilizations. In all the other civilizations, the Chinese emperor, the caliph, the Byzantine emperor, the Roman emperor, had extraordinary powers of controlling what went on in their culture and of censoring thought. What the striking thing about the Middle Ages in Europe is that the Pope wasn't in control and the Holy Roman Emperor wasn't in control, and the king wasn't necessarily in control. There was a tremendous variety of overlapping jurisdictions of town authorities, of university authorities, of royal authorities, of papal authorities, and so on and so forth, which meant that it was much harder for orthodoxy of thought to be enforced. I think that's extremely important. Again, I point out in traditional civilizations, there was a major social gulf, between the merchant class and the governing class. So merchants were despised almost universally as an ignoble form of life. And secondly, between the scholars and the craftsmen. So the scholars lived in a world of books and thoughts and theories, and the craftsmen had a non-literate culture which was passed on by personal experience in the workshop. And the thing about European life was that the towns were run predominantly by the merchant class, and in the towns also the craftsmen in their guilds raised their social status very considerably. So it became socially possible for craftsmen and intellectuals to interact. As for example, Galileo was a highly educated man who knew Latin, but he could also grind his own lenses, which would have been unthinkable, say, in China or in the classical civilization, in Greco-Roman society. The theorists did not contaminate themselves with manual labor of that kind. But it was only when you could bring together the craft knowledge and theoretical knowledge that experimental science really became possible. And that the idea that you could actually, I mean, an example of this would be the discovery of air pressure by Torricelli, and the idea that actually air weighed something. This was, and then you have the experiments playing around with the vacuum, Papin, for example, then there was this man in England who was a man called Newcomen, who was essentially a craftsman. He made pumps, and he was thoroughly familiar with iron manufacturing, pistons, cylinders, everything to do with that, and also with mining. And so he realized the enormous importance of in the Cornish tin mines. They were going down deep and being flooded with water. And they needed some way of pumping the mines more efficient than water wheels or horse-driven pumps. And he also was a literate man, and the Royal Society was highly engaged with craftspeople. They were constantly publishing and interacting with the scientists of people like Hooke. Were extremely practical and interested in craft activities, and one of the publications of the Royal Society was about the vacuum, Papin's work of putting steam into a cylinder that it condensed, and the atmospheric pressure pressed the piston down. Well, Newcomen put that together and produced the first really workable steam engine, which was a world-shaking discovery. But it required a practical engineer actually to put the damn thing together, because a theorist would not have had the engineering knowledge that he had. And so it was therefore, cutting a long story short, to answer your question, it was the fact that in Europe and in this case in Britain, that craftsmen could be brought together with scientific theorists, which would produce things like the telescope, like the steam engine, like all the other inventions that were made, that enables the natural sciences to take off. But in other words, it's not enough just to have literacy and to have the state and to have law and order and to have a high level of technology. You also have to have other special factors, such as the ones I've been talking about, that bring craftsmen and theorists together, and which also have a dynamic economy. So, I mean, a lot of early science was about making money. Newcomen wanted to make money by selling steam engines. Galileo made money by selling his telescopes. There was a huge amount of financial incentive in this. So it's like baking a cake. You've got to have the right ingredients. And so some of the more specific aspects of civilization have to have a specific set of circumstances which are not going to be universal at all. They're peculiar to each culture, which is why some cultures don't go anywhere. Some cultures, for example, as I say, don't develop the state. Because of the particular, what I call their core principles. In the Taoiseach, for example, because there was no basis of authority, of hereditary authority, there was no way in which mediators could develop. Again, they despised old age, they didn't respect it, so you couldn't have elders' councils. So political centralization was going absolutely nowhere in Papua New Guinea. There was never going to be the state there. Whereas in Polynesia, they had a different attitude to kinship. The elder son was hugely important in Polynesia. It didn't matter on the Taoiseach, they couldn't care less. But in Polynesia, the elder son then became the focus of seniority, of political seniority. It had mana, more sanctity than younger sons. And so there in Polynesia, you had the core by which the state could develop, and did in a few cases, like Tonga and Hawaii, and vestigially among the Maori. So it's the particular characteristics, not just the state formation by itself, it's the particular characteristics of the culture that will either go further or not go anywhere at all.
Yes, it's the potential evolutionary potential. I think it's the concept you use.
Yes, that's right.
Of some cultural traits that allows the development to go further.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I would like to close with one last question that we also wanted to make to you. Well, we are actually called. We are a group of scholars and some students, professors, etc. That we tend to call ourselves a group of historico-genetical studies.
Yeah.
So this means that we read a lot of Gunter Dux. So in his book, he says there's one reference to you in his book.
Yes.
When he says that he does not agree that much with you, the idea that in primitive societies they have not achieved an operational state, operational,
pre-operational.
Yes, that they have not. How do I say it? That they have not achieved an operational stage, but that actually he argues that they might be like in the middle of the pre-operational stage and the operational stage in some kind of proto-operational pre-operational state. So I would like to know, what do you think about this?
I can't remember the particular question. I mean, generally, as far as developmental psychology is concerned, Dux and I are very much in agreement. I can't remember him us actually differing on that. I mean, he accepts that a great deal of there's a great deal of pre-operational thinking, and I've never denied that. Of course, there can be some concrete operational thinking. The only point I would make is that I see no evidence of formal operational thinking, but I don't remember Dux disagreeing with me on that. I think we disagree on social evolution. But I don't recall him saying.
Maybe it's me, because well, actually,
he's generally emphasized how much he and I agree on the Piagetian side of things and collective representations.
Yes, of course.
But maybe we can talk a little bit more about what could be the disagreement in that way.
Oh, I think that having studied in the way that he is not primitive society and the way its institutions develop, my own account of social evolution is to say, well, the cognitive side is very important, but there are simply some aspects of social institutions which are not particularly enlightened by knowing anything about psychology. They have their own dynamic and their own processes of development, which I've explained to some extent. You'll find in How We Got Here, which I do not relate to his line of thinking at all. I think developmental psychology will take you a long way in terms of culture, but in terms of actual social organization, state formation, for example, I don't think that developmental psychology will tell you very much. After the state has developed and after there are legal institutions, then indeed there is a lot of cognitive development as once that's got underway. But I think the explanation of state formation in itself is primarily sociological, not psychological, and I think that's where I would differ from him, and insofar as I understand his position on that. I mean, I didn't in the psychogenetic theory of culture. I have the English translation of that. I would find quite a lot I would disagree with there. I think it is too much focused on developmental psychology and not enough on social institutions. But he and I have been allies for many years on the other side. Then, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for your kindness, and we are very sorry for what happened earlier. But we managed to make a nice discussion with you. That's what we.
Well, I very much enjoyed our discussion. It's gone very well. Was it deliberate, this interference with our conference, or was it just some technical glitch?
We don't know. We don't know.
But it was deliberate. It was someone who was doing.
Oh, it was intentional, was it?
Yeah, it was intentional. We don't know what reasons, but it was intentional.
Anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in your conference. And well, I will, David, send you my little notes on Elias, and maybe you can correct me and fill them in where you think I'm wrong, because I'd like to discuss his theories in more detail. If that's okay.
Yes, of course, of course. Thank you very much. We might even have another conversation about this, about that subject, whenever you want.
Yes. Okay. Very good.
Really
yeah,
good.
Well, bye-bye, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Esperemos un momento, yo me cercioro de que terminamos la transmisión en vivo.
Todavía creo que está la transmisión en vivo.
Davi, a próxima mesa vai cambiar o link ou é o mesmo?
No, es el mismo, ese link no tiene ese tipo de problemas.